Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Mr. Robot Season 2, Episode 3, Kernel Panic. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Mr. Robot, so I'll have to give a spoiler warning for Mr. Robot up to Season 2, Episode 3 if you haven't seen up to this point. You may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So this was a pretty passable episode. It did raise the stakes a bit with some shocking moments, but for the most part it was just putting the pieces on the chessboard. And parts of it did kind of feel like a rehash of things that we've already seen, so overall it was alright. So the first thing I want to talk about is something I tend to skip over as it's not technically part of the episode, and that is the previously on segment. I think it's worth mentioning this time because the way that it was structured seemed to imply that Mr. Robot was responsible for shooting Gideon and Romero, as it showed a scene of Gideon threatening Mr. Robot and then Mr. Robot saying Gideon was a problem and they need to be taken care of, and then Mr. Robot slitting his throat, and then of Gideon getting shot. And with Romero, they played the clip of him saying that he didn't trust Elliot, and then of Mr. Robot putting a gun to his head. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but these previously on tend to indicate what's happening in the show, so it seems like they're trying to use these murders, say that these murders were Mr. Robot's doing, but I'm not totally sold on that yet, but that seems to be what they're implying. So we start the actual episode with a flashback to Mowgli first approaching Romero about acquiring the old arcade as their base of operations and enticing him to join their movement. There we get the backstory of the arcade and why it is their perfect base of operations. We also learn where the term F Society comes from, as the arcade was called Fun Society, but the U and the N, and then when the sign fell off. So I loved this scene. It was so great to get the backstory of how F Society started as the show began, a while after it started, and follow Elliot's perspective, who had no memory of it. So it was great seeing this. And of course it was a setup to see Romero again, when Mowgli goes to visit him, he finds him dead, which I got to say was one of the more tense moments of these episodes and the events. It just opened up a whole can of worms, as there's now a huge mystery as to who killed him. Was it related to Gideon's murder? Is someone going to want to kill Darlene and the others? Interesting mysteries, but who knows when they'll be resolved. So last week I was wondering where the other two members of F Society were, and was speculating that maybe the show would just not show them again, and perhaps for some reason they couldn't get the actors again, so the show would just pretend that they don't exist. I'm glad to see that I was wrong, and they dealt with them in an interesting way, with Romero showing he was murdered, and with Trenton showing that she had dropped out, which made perfect sense with the way she was behaving in the previous season, that she wouldn't see eye to eye with Darlene. But it is interesting that Mowgli assumed it was the Dark Army and that they are killing off anyone connected to the hack. And it seems like he also believes it likely that Elliot is the one who gave them up to the Dark Army. But either way, Mowgli and Trenton don't seem to trust Darlene and Elliot anymore. I personally think that they're wrong, but we'll see. It does make me wonder what Mowgli and Trenton will do next. Sounds to me like they may do something stupid. I think it's possible that Tyrell Wellick might somehow be connected to these murders, or at least Romero's murder, but that's just a wild guess. But that's kind of the thing with this episode. It definitely asks more questions than it answers, such as it resolves the cliffhanger from the previous episode, but by not explaining anything really. We didn't get any answers involving Tyrell Wellick and what happened to him. In fact, what we got were more questions, as Tyrell seemed to be implying he's implementing some sort of plan that he and Elliot planned together, and yet we still have no idea as to what that is, so it only deepens the mystery of what the hell is actually going on. But neither this nor any of the other pressing questions are addressed in this episode. Instead, Elliot continues to try to fight off Mr. Robot, but this time is going into panic mode and eventually relying on drugs to try to get rid of him. So this leads to a sequence where Elliot is nabbed by the FBI looking guys and is led by the guy that Elliot spotted in the cafe in the previous episode looking at him, which we learn in this episode that he isn't real and is just another figment of his imagination. In fact, I guessed it pretty much right away during this scene that it was all in Elliot's head, because it seemed very reminiscent of the movie A Beautiful Mind. That main guy seems to, very much like Ed Harris's character from that movie. And this led to the most disgusting scene in the series so far, where we find out that the illusion was just there to get Elliot to vomit up the drugs, but once he learns what's happening, he goes in the vomit and eats the drugs again. Man, that was so disgusting. I had to look away. I couldn't bear to watch it. It made me feel so ill. And it was interesting, the look of shock on Mr. Robot's face as he watched him do this. It seemed to be really taken aback by this. I think this scene was really effective in showing the state that Elliot is in, where he's eating his own vomit to try to get rid of his imaginary friend. Yeah, he's crazy. But still forces me to wonder why, doesn't he simply just commit himself to a mental institution to solve his Mr. Robot problem? So then we get these amazing sequences. That's one of those awesome montages that only the show can pull off, and it was so well done. It really puts you in the mind of someone who is really on heavy drugs. If there's one thing the show is good at, it's putting you inside Elliot's mind and making you see things from his perspective. It was so funny seeing him all drugged out and how he thought everything was great because Mr. Robot was gone. Of course, you knew that taking insane amounts of drugs not only is a bad idea, but is unsustainable. And then the montage turns dark, where lots of weird things happen to show how downhill he's going again. This was pulled off so amazingly well and put you into Elliot's mindset to show how fucked up things are, and it was great television. Then on the downturn, we get the amazing scene where he flips out at his church group and goes on an epic anti-God rant. And after he finished, and he was like, "Oh, please don't tell me I said that out loud." And then he looks around at everyone who is just in shock. And he's like, "Oh, shit, I did say that out loud." I gotta admit, I was laughing my ass off there. I mean, he called religious people fanboys of poorly written science fiction. Such an awesome, line in the show. But it's so indicative of one of Elliot's rants. But of course, it also illustrates how thoroughly he's losing it, which makes sense after coming down from 5 days straight of taking an insane amount of drugs. So then enters Ray, who's a pretty interesting character, especially when he's established as some sort of criminal. We're not entirely sure what kind, but the kind that needs a hacker, and will have people beaten to accomplish his goals. And this adds a really nice level of suspense to the story, and he's no longer a boring character that I wasn't really interested in. That speech he gave to the hacker that he had beaten was a really well-written scene. It reminded me a bit of Quentin Tarantino. I loved it. In fact, it made me appreciate his character more overall, as when he does finally meet up with Elliot again and talks all understanding with him, we know that there's an undercurrent of danger surrounding him. However, he seems to only want to use force when necessary, as he does seem to know how to manipulate people. And the fact that he got Elliot's journal and read it, and he knows all about Mr. Robot, makes him a tad bit more dangerous, as he will try to exploit that in his favor. However, I do believe that he genuinely does feel a connection with Elliot and can relate to him by, talking about his dead wife. But still, it doesn't eliminate the element of danger that surrounds him. But of course, the main way he impressed Elliot was by coming up with a solution to get rid of Mr. Robot, and that is to not get rid of him. Instead, try to work with him and micromanage the situation instead of trying to control everything, which is actually pretty wise. So he does seem like a pretty smart guy, so it'll be interesting to see where he and Elliot's relationship goes from here, but I do hope that it does tie back to the main story eventually. So let me really briefly just touch on this popular fan theory I've been seeing popping up everywhere. It's almost like just as prevalent as R plus L equals J. I see it on almost every review show. Is the theory that Elliot is actually in some sort of prison or mental institution rather than actually living with his mom, and he just dreamed up this illusion, and that would explain things like why he's having lunch with the same person every day and why he's going to basketball games all the time, because stuff like that is and Bible group is reminiscent of prison. However, I think this episode sort of makes it seem like that's not the case, because for one thing, we see Ray outside, in his own scene without Elliot present, which means Ray is a real person. Unless, of course, Ray is a real person, but he's a guard who is leaving the prison to go on his daytime adventures. But I doubt that. I really think that this episode makes that theory seem a lot less likely, and I was never that on board with it in the first place. However, it does make me suspicious that Darlene and the others still have not been seen with Elliot, and none of the established characters from the previous season, except for Krista, has been seen with Elliot. And the one time we saw Krista, Elliot actually cut the scene short and basically refused to tell us, the imaginary friend, what happened in that scene. So that makes me really suspicious. And the fact that Darlene and the others, when they talk about Elliot, they use vague terms. They never specifically say where he is or what he's up to. So this does raise my suspicion a bit. But, well, I don't know. Maybe it's not prison, maybe it's something else. We'll see. So we get another couple of side plots in this episode, which I don't have much to say about, particularly Angela's, which I'm not really very interested in, although I will say it looks like it has the potential to get better, as with Price offering those two guys that were involved in her father's death and cover up. But it was interesting, he got her to meet them first and then told her all these good things about them, like they have caring families, they donate to charity, but, they killed your father, so here's the evidence to throw them in jail. He's definitely fucking with her head, but it still remains to be seen for what end. And we also get more of the storyline following the FBI agent, DePiro, a quirky character. However, we seem to be wasting a lot of time with her. I suppose now, that they're not focusing on Tyrell and his wife, that they have to have some other, storyline to, drawn out, slow paced, seemingly irrelevant storyline to take its place. And in that regard, the storyline isn't so bad. It's interesting she seems to have a relationship, or at least rely a lot on her computer voice thingy. However, whenever there's a piece of technology like that that's introduced in the show, it's only a matter of time before it's hacked. It's like Chekhov's computer hack. They don't introduce a computer thingy like that if it ain't going to be hacked. So I'm just really curious on how they will eventually do it. But I guess I'll have to wait and see. Anyway, her investigating eventually leads her to the arcade with the sign F Society, which does make me wonder if it was actually that smart to call their group the name that the sign on the building right there says for everyone to see. It's not very inconspicuous, is it? So my rating for Kernel Panic out of 10 is a 7, very good. Not an outstanding episode, as it's mostly just a setup episode, but has some amazing, well-constructed sequences, such as Elliot's drug montage, and to see him lose his shit at the church, which was hilarious. and also introducing the dangerous element of Ray and the mystery involving Romero's death and who might be next. But all in all, a bit too drawn out, and the drug out sequences did kind of feel like a retread of the season 1 episode Damon's, but all in all, a decent episode. So that's it for my review of Kernel Panic. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of Mr. Robot. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Dark Matter, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.